Hey everybody, welcome back to our last lecture for the current unit that we're looking at with the Paleozoic. Today we're going to look at the Permian period and the Permo-Triassic Extinction, so really bringing the Paleozoic to a close. So the Permian period spanned from about 290 to about 251 million years ago. This really brings us to the end of the Paleozoic era, so right about into the middle of the Phanerozoic overall. Okay, and after this we go into the Triassic period, which is the first period of the Mesozoic era, but we'll deal with that after the next exam. So we now have a fully formed Pangean supercontinent. If you'll remember, this was happening mostly during the last half of the Paleozoic. The Mississippian and the Pennsylvanian, or the Carboniferous, if you will, is when we were really seeing a lot of that establishing. And you notice that during the Mississippian and the Pennsylvanian, sea levels were going down, down, down. They were fluctuating quite a lot during the Pennsylvanian. We talked about last time with the cyclothems. But in the Permian, we have the fully uplifted Central Pangean Mountains, which you can see here, right in that area. So this has a very interesting influence on the climate of the rest of the planet. You notice on this map all of the yellow areas. Those are deserts. Those are areas where we had deserts or very arid conditions in the Permian period. Now, part of the reason for this is we now have one big supercontinent. We do have the Paleotethys and the Panthalastic Ocean. So here's the Panthalastic and here's the Paleotethys. These bodies of water making up still a majority of the planet, and all of our continents are scrunched together in this one place. By the time evaporated water gets to the inside of those continents, it's already been rained out. So this is kind of like a rain shadow effect, similar to what we saw with the Akkadian orogeny in the Silurian. We have this large landmass, and that makes it really hard for weather patterns holding moisture to get to the continental interior. Plus, we have this huge mountain range in the middle of it, which causes even more of a rain shadow effect. So a giant supercontinent that is becoming significantly more desertified or desert-like is going to have some major influences on life. Okay. So again, two main ocean basins here, the Panthalastic, which someday we'll be calling the Pacific, and the Tethys. Now, if you look at where the Tethys is, the Paleotethys Ocean, look what continents are around it. We have in the north parts of what will become Europe, and to the southwest we have Africa and India. And if you kind of think about where those land masses move versus where they are today, or where they are here in the Permian, the Tethys Ocean someday becomes what we call the Mediterranean, which is the only body of water right now in between Europe and Africa. And that's what we have kind of left over. The Paleotethys is still with us a little bit in the form of the Mediterranean. So climates in the Permian, as we were just saying, just the basic size of Pangea. It's so large that it becomes a very arid supercontinent. Big land masses, it makes it really hard for weather patterns to get moisture all the way to the continental interior. So we start seeing an increase in the size of these Permian deserts. There would have also been increased seasonality. So you would have had wet seasons and dry seasons, very similar to what we see in places like East Africa today. Those coal forests that we had in the Pennsylvanian in the last part of the Carboniferous, the part of our cyclothems, those are pretty much gone. At this point, climate starts to stabilize, but it just stabilizes on being dry and seasonally, and very high seasonality. But we don't see the coming and going ice ages every 400,000 years like we saw in the Pennsylvanian. So here's North America during the middle part of the Permian. Notice we have the Appalachian Mountains raised up. They're still shedding lots and lots of sediment to the west, or technically to a bit of the north at the time. And this is producing some muddy plains, but we're not seeing that frequent flip-flopping of climate like we saw before. But this is expanding our terrestrial habitats, just mostly in the form of sandy alluvial plains and deserts. The Appalachians at this time are about the size of the Himalayas today. They're absolutely huge. And today we know that the Himalayas offer this or provide this rain shadow effect, which is why the Tibetan area is so dry and India is so wet. We're going to see the same kind of thing happening here. So today, where we have our Midwest, those were highland deserts in the Permian. So where we're standing today in the Midwest, that used to be deserts back in the Permian. You did have some swampy lowlands. I don't want to make it sound like there's absolutely no humidity on the planet during the Permian. There is, but it's just in kind of the more lower land areas, farther away from those mountains. So around what would be the high plains today is where you had a lot of those. Further west, towards what will someday be our west coast, we're seeing lots and lots of explosive volcanism. And this is adding some really unique minerals and chemical conditions to the shallow water environments that we have in the West at the time. In other words, we start getting lots and lots of phosphate being deposited, mostly from a lot of this volcanic eruption. So as we start to see climates dry out, plants and animals start moving landward even more. Now, remember, we started out with things like amphibians when we talked about the transition of life onto land for the Devonian. And amphibians are kind of unique. They're still tied to water for their reproductive cycle. Frogs lay eggs and they become tadpoles, and then they're almost fish-like, and then they come out of the water when they're ready. However, we're going to talk about a more advanced group of tetrapods, and these are amniotes. Amniotes are animals, they're a type of tetrapod that lay eggs that don't require being submerged in water. We are amniotes, okay, as mammals, but so are reptiles. So the cladogram here for our more advanced tetrapods for amniotes include reptiles, and that's going to be your snakes, lizards, crocodiles, dinosaurs, and birds. And then synapsids are a very special group, what we used to call mammal-like reptiles, but this is actually the lineage that mammals derive from. So we are one of the last living groups of synapsids. All mammals today are the only representation of synapsids. Okay. So some of the animals we're going to look at here, you might look at and think, oh, those are lizards, or oh, they're dinosaurs. They're actually synapsids. They're a separate group of amniotes that aren't true reptiles. Okay. So the big thing to take away from this, though, is that amniotes are these terrestrial egg-laying animals. Now, you might think we're mammals, we don't lay eggs, and that's true. But the way that human physiology is worked out, or most mammalian physiology, there is an egg involved, and it stays within the womb until that animal is old enough to be born. So it's equivalent of hatching. And we do have some egg-laying mammals alive today, like the platypus and the echidna. So amniotes. I'm an amniote, you're an amniote, your pets are amniotes, unless you have a pet fish or amphibian. But no dinosaurs. So what makes an amniote an amniote, or the different groups of amniotes? A lot of this comes down to their skulls. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this, but there's two groups I want to point out, and that's diapsids and synapsids. The letters that you see corresponding here on the skulls, these are different bones of the skulls. Okay, so like the cheekbone is called the jugal, and the bone right behind the eye is called the postorbital. That's why we have PO. Now, on diapsids, let me just kind of draw in a little bit here. So here's where the eyeball would go, and on a diapsid, and here's where it would go on a synapsid. Okay, so hold on, that's not really drawing very well. There we go. There's eyeballs. I'm not very good at drawing on this. So with that, if that's where the eyeball is going, then what about these extra holes in the back? So again, if here's my eyeball, okay, I actually got a stylus pen now. Okay, what about these other holes here? This one, which you notice on the diapsids, they have an upper hole in the back of their skull, and synapsids have one at the bottom, and diapsids also have one at the bottom. Okay. So these extra openings, which have names that we'll talk about more in lab, are places for muscle attachment. So if you look at a human skull, or just feel on your own face, I know right now we're not supposed to touch our face, your cheekbone, okay, there's a bony ridge that from your cheek that goes all the way up to about your ear. And you can feel that bone along your cheek. Now, if you move your fingers above and below, like touch your temple, and right below that bony ridge, on like near where your molars are, and you move your mouth, you can feel the muscles, especially in your temple. Like when you chew, you can feel that in your temples. That is a synapsid characteristic. That bone that you're feeling, that bony ridge, that is part of what used to be the quadratojugal of a synapsid. We still have that, and that's what that bony ridge is for. It's for muscle attachment. On diapsids, like crocodiles and lizards, they have an extra one right up here at the top. So not only do they have that lower temporal bar, they have an upper one too. So that's why if you get bit by a crocodile, it's a lot worse than even getting bit by a dog, because they have an extra bar at the back of their skull for muscle attachment. So diapsids, things like birds and crocodiles and dinosaurs and snakes and lizards, these are all diapsids based on their skulls. We as mammals are the last living group of synapsids, which don't have that upper opening, they just have the lower one. I apologize for my crappy drawings. So, Dimetrodon. You've probably seen a picture of this animal before in books. It is a synapsid. It's a ground-dwelling animal. It looks lizard-like, but if you actually look at its skull, it's more like ours than it is like a reptile's. Probably not really warm-blooded. What we think this animal did is use the fin on its back and these long radiating spines. Those spines are actually part of its vertebra. So if you look at a vertebra in general, you've got the round part, that's the centrum. You have the neural arches and spines, and then you've got the opening in the middle that the spinal tissue goes through. On Dimetrodon, though, they have their centrum and the little transverse processes, and then that's the really tall neural spine. So those things coming out of its back are actually part of its spine. And then we think they had a piece of flesh over it because they probably weren't used for like protection or anything. They were very, very delicate. But we think this animal would have used that fin as a place to push blood up so it could actually kind of warm up its body heat, their body temperature that way. So it kind of used it as a solar panel, but when it wanted to cool off, it could then turn it into the wind and use it as a radiator. Reptiles or cold-blooded animals need to do something like that. They can't maintain their own body temperature. This is something that synapsids eventually evolved to do, but at this stage we don't think that they were actually warm-blooded yet. Similar to Dimetrodon, we have this guy, Edaphosaurus, which also sprawled out, cold-blooded type animal. It also has the big fin on the back, except this has these little weird bumps and hooks on it, which are kind of cute. We think this one's actually a plant eater, though. Looking at the teeth, it looks more like it's evolved for chewing plants, and lived at the same time as Dimetrodon, but probably used a similar kind of body heat, warm up, cool off function. So remember, the reason that we say that synapsids and reptiles are both types of amniotes is based on phylogenetics. It's based on this Cladistics approach, where all of the organisms you see here are tetrapods. Okay. However, one group of tetrapods are the amphibians, the other group are the amniotes. The amniotes can then be broken down further into synapsids and reptiles, and for reptiles we'll also just put diapsids. They fall there too. Reptiles are a type of diapsid. Okay, and this isn't just based on general similarity, it's based on their evolution. So it's based on what we call shared derived characters. So characteristics that they share that they got from a common ancestor. So in this case with amniotes, it's amniotic fluid in the amniotic egg. As we get later into the Permian, though, we start seeing a new group of synapsids that are called the therapsids. These appear to be some of the first warm-blooded synapsids, and we think that they still did lay eggs, though. So these are things that they almost superficially look like a cross between a reptile and like a wolf. Some of these therapsids are really quite strange, but we think of these as proto-mammals or early mammals. They're not actually mammals yet because they're not giving live birth. They don't, as far as we know, have mammary glands or hair, maybe, maybe not, but they were warm-blooded and they were laying eggs still. So they're this really kind of strange group of animals that lived at the very late part of the Permian. So the evolution of mammals really goes back to the late part of the Paleozoic. Things like Dimetrodon, which is a synapsid, to Thrinaxodon, which is a therapsid, to then Morganucodon, which is actually an early mammal that we see in the Mesozoic era, in the Triassic and the Jurassic. So that's kind of the general transition we see here. We go from a synapsid to a therapsid to a mammal. I mean, keep in mind that therapsids and mammals are synapsids, but these are the different stages that we see. And today we have some things to compare if we really want to know what they may have functioned like in their physiology. We have a modern order of mammals called monotremes, or Monotremata, and it's made of only 2 genera, so 2 species of one and 1 species of the other, so 3 species total of monotremes. These are egg-laying mammals, and one of them is the duck-billed platypus, and the other is the spiny echidna, or the spiny anteater. And these are native to Australia and New Guinea because they have all the cool animals, but they do actually lay eggs. So monotremes are a very important group if we want to understand what maybe therapsids were functioning like. We're not saying these are like living therapsids, but they have enough similarities in their physiology where we can learn something about these extinct organisms by studying modern egg-laying mammals, since they're pretty rare anyway. Now, amphibians are still around today, thus they were still around in the Permian as well, but they were a little bit different. They were a little bit larger. One of the most interesting ones is this guy here, which is known as Diplocaulus. It has this huge boomerang-shaped head, and we think it used that to actually hunt. So if you look carefully at one of their skulls, they're covered with these lines and pits all around the front, and that allows similar animals today to feel when there's motion in the water. Sharks actually do this too. They have little pits around their mouths that they can sense when there's movement in the water, and that helps them steer around and swim. So Diplocaulus had this almost gigantic satellite dish for a head where it could sense movement in the water when it was going after prey or staying away from larger predators. However, as environments become drier, we start seeing more amphibians become true reptiles, which is one of the reasons the amniotic egg probably evolved, was to work really well with these terrestrial environments. If you don't have to be near the pond all the time and still reproduce, that's a benefit. So we start seeing amphibians that are a little bit more terrestrially adapted, as well as reptiles themselves. Now again, some of these amphibians are quite large, and we have some large amphibians today to study and compare to what we see in the Permian. Our modern salamanders, giant salamanders, include the hellbender, which is the largest amphibian we have in North America. It's the largest one. So keep in mind it's about 74 centimeters long, so that's about 3 feet. So hellbenders, which we can find in southern Wisconsin, northern Illinois, can be quite large. But the Chinese giant salamander at 1.8 meters, so that's really the largest right there. Those things get absolutely huge, and they can actually take your hand off. They're pretty feisty. Now, what about the marine life of the Permian? We have some really interesting things going on here with our life at the end of the Permian, especially since we're approaching a mass extinction. One of the real weird things we start seeing are our late Paleozoic brachiopods. So we talked about productive brachiopods a bit in our early Paleozoic lab. Remember, this is a group of brachiopods that have done away with the fleshy stalk, the pedicle, to anchor themselves into the sediment. Instead, they use spikes that are all over their shells. And there's another subgroup of productids known as the rictophenids. Now, when you look at a rictophenid brachiopod, it doesn't look like a brachiopod. In fact, to some people, it looks like a rugose coral. It looks like a horn coral, one of these cone-shaped corals. And that's because since those corals are extinct, this brachiopod has kind of evolved to fill that same niche. So even though they look very much like a coral, they're actually a brachiopod. And they've got the long spine, since they're related to productids that they use to anchor in and wrap around structures that allow them to continue functioning. So the rictophenids and the productids are very specialized, really weird brachiopods that are exclusive to the late Paleozoic. We also have these really small things called foraminifera. Now, in lab, we talked about foraminifera. These are essentially an amoeba that grows a shell. However, the fusulinids, which get up to 4 millimeters long, about the size of a grain of rice, are absolutely huge for a single-celled animal. Remember, if you're holding like a grain of rice, right, as a comparison for size, imagine that's a one-celled animal. Most one-celled animals are too small to see with the naked eye, so that makes these absolutely humongous. Um, and so as a result, most foraminifera today are about the size of a grain of silt, and they can float in the surface waters where they will eat algae. These things are heavy enough where they're not going to be able to float, so these are what we call a benthic foram. They're living at the bottom of the seafloor. But still, they're recording what those bottom water conditions were like as they grow their shells. So if we want to understand the chemistry of the Permian bottom waters, we can study Permian fusellinids. So as we are kind of looking at the Permian, I want to talk a little bit more about some of those facies, because as we're dropping sea level, we're exposing lots of sediment, which oxidizes it, and we get a lot of red beds. So the Permian and the Pennsylvanian have lots and lots of oxidized sediment. Okay. We also have a lot of, as I mentioned before, a lot of volcanic eruptions in what is now the American West. So that's contributing to the chemistry that we're seeing in some of these red beds. And now that we have Pangea assembled, I want to go back and revisit a couple of the things we talked about when we were discussing Alfred Wegener before our previous exam, like how organisms migrated across Gondwanaland. Okay. Remember, this was some of the first proof of continental drift, what Wegener and Dutoit were calling what we later discussed as plate tectonics. So remember Mesosaurus, this was one of these little animals that Wegener studied as evidence of the supercontinent. Mesosaurus is interesting because it's actually the first reptile, terrestrial reptile, to go back to an aquatic lifestyle. So we have fish evolving into rhipidistan lobe-finned fish, which evolved into tetrapods, and tetrapods into amphibians, amphibians to reptiles, and this reptile says, I'm going back to the water. They're not very big. They're only about a meter long, maybe 3 feet. They're found in South America and South Africa, and they're freshwater. So these things weren't living in the ocean. It wasn't swimming across an ocean basin. These are lived in lakes and rivers, probably ate shellfish and small fish that would swim around in there too. For plants, the Glossopteris seed fern is incredibly abundant. There's dozens and dozens of species of what we call this tongue leaf. I always thought they looked more like feathers, but Glossopteris actually means tongue leaf. Apparently, to some people, they look like a tongue. But these are a seed fern. So it was a fern that produced seeds, which is kind of strange. Most ferns reproduce with spores. So these are very, very abundant in a variety of different environments, pretty much found on every single Gondwanan landmass. You find them in Permian sediments in Madagascar to Permian sediments in Australia and Antarctica, India, South America, and Africa. It's a very successful plant. And then we end the Permian period with the biggest mass extinction the planet has ever seen. So about 250, 251 million years ago, that is where we mark the boundary of what we call the Permo-Triassic, or the PT, extinction event. This was absolutely huge. It wiped out 90 to 95% of all marine species. Now, since most life is in the oceans, to lose 90 to 95% of all ocean life is essentially almost losing all life. But this is the end of that dominance of the Paleozoic fauna. So this is the last time brachiopods are an abundant marine organism. This is the end of trilobites. This is the end of echinoderms being really, really abundant. This is the very end of any remaining tabulate and rugose corals, which were mostly gone anyway. So it's considered the greatest environmental disaster in Earth history, and it's still being debated exactly what caused it. So, as I've mentioned before, when you're looking at extinctions, it's very, very important to note what went extinct, what didn't go extinct, and what was affected but not maybe completely wiped out. Because if it's affected, that means that it had some kind of influence on it. So for example, at the end of the Permian, we have no more trilobites, but then again, they've been declining since the Ordovician anyway. Paleozoic corals, gone, in decline since the Devonian. Fusellinid forams are gone. Most of our primitive synapsids, the mammal-like reptiles, so Dimetrodon, is extinct. The following four, though, we didn't lose all of, but most of. We lost most of our brachiopods, especially the specialized ones. Most of our specialized bryozoans, most of our crinoids, and most of our therapsids, those proto-mammals. Okay. Now, if we take the synapsids and therapsids out of the picture real quick, because, let's be honest, they're terrestrial, and we look at trilobites, corals, fusilids, brachiopods, bryozoans, and crinoids, what do they all have in common? And that's that they're all made of calcium carbonate. So there's very good evidence that the end Permian extinction involved something that disrupted the ability of these organisms to produce calcium carbonate shells. Now, today we know a good way to break down calcium carbonate is to increase acidification of the oceans. If you want to have organisms have a hard time building their calcite shells, add acid. A good way of increasing ocean acidification is a change in climate, because it's something we're observing in our oceans today. So there's lots of theories that go on about what caused this Permian apocalypse. Okay. Climate change and sea level fall could have played a role. Now, this is more of a gradual process, so if this is what caused that extinction, we could be looking at what's called a threshold event, which means a lot of pressure building up on the ecosystems, and then one thing leads to a cascading events of extinction. That's possible. Massive volcanic eruptions are a possibility too. In what is now Siberia, in the Permian, there were massive amounts of basaltic eruptions. Okay. Lots and lots of basaltic eruptions. So this could have added a lot of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, which could have then driven a change in climate and a fall in sea level. Ocean acidification, again, inability for an organism to produce that calcium carbonate shell. This can also be influenced by changes in climate. Asteroid or comet impact. In my experience, if there's an extinction event, somebody is going to claim there's an asteroid or an impact event. Unfortunately, in this case, we don't have any evidence of that. You got to remember that the oldest seafloor we have is Triassic or Jurassic in age, so it's much younger than this. And most of the planet is ocean floor. So if we did get hit in the ocean with an asteroid, or if we did get hit by an asteroid in the Permian, there's a 75% chance it was going to hit in the ocean. And we wouldn't have that ocean floor today. So there's no evidence for or against any kind of asteroid impact. However, I think it does kind of, we have enough evidence though that yes, there were major volcanic eruptions. We had already disrupted climate, and we were seeing this change during the Permian of lowering sea levels and increasing some temperatures. This goes into ocean acidification, inability for organisms to make shells. So I think there's a lot of things going on in the Permian, one right after the other, that just does not make it a good time for organisms to be alive. So as we come to a close on this, okay, just to recap again from last time, if we look at the Mississippian, we have the tail end of this Kaskaskia sequence. But while it's at its peak, we have the Acadian and antler orogenies, both in the east and west, respectively. We have our new reefs made of crinoids and bryozoans. Amphibians are diversifying, so are arthropods. As we go into the Pennsylvanian, we have our fluctuating sea levels as apparent from the preservation of cyclothems, which include coals from our coal swamps. The producted and rictophenid brachiopods are diversifying throughout the Pennsylvanian into the early Permian, as are early reptiles, including our finback synapsids and then our advanced therapsids. Meanwhile, tectonically, we are uplifting the ancestral Rockies. That's those west coast volcanics. The last and final Appalachian mountain building event, the proper Allegheny or Appalachian orogeny, takes place. And then we end it all with an increase in deserts and a huge mass extinction right at the end of the Permian period. Okay, so again, I would recommend taking this diagram from your book, as well as the Middle Paleozoic, which looked at Silurian and Devonian, and the Early Paleozoic, which looked at the Cambrian and Ordovician, and kind of line these all up because it shows a nice relationship between what's going on with sea level, what's going on geologically, and what's going on biologically. And this concludes our information for exam 3, because after the Permian extinction, it takes a while in the Triassic, but that's when the Mesozoic era begins, and we have a whole new group of organisms that kind of take over land at the time. So the end of the Permian is really like the end of one world, and then the Triassic is the beginning of a totally new one. So this concludes everything for exam 3, and I'm still going to do what we would have done should we have been meeting in class, and that's talk about potential essay questions. This exam will be set up very, very similar to how the lecture exam 2 was set up on Canvas. I'll be using the same type of format, but I still want to give you those potential essay questions just like we did for last time. Obviously, where it says draw, that's not something I really know you'll be able to do in this type of interaction, but my thinking is if you can draw it while you're studying, then you can look at a diagram and you can explain it. So I still recommend you be able to draw it because that will help you be able to explain it better in words. So be able to diagram the Paleozoic time and Precambrian time scale. So don't completely purge those Precambrian stuff from exam 2. I want you to be able to show the relationship between the Paleozoic times and the Precambrian time. So in other words, be able to reconstruct the geologic time scale from the Precambrian through the end of the Permian. Talk about the challenges plants and animals transition to and from a marine to a terrestrial lifestyle. So this goes back to our lecture on those transitions where we talked about dehydration, getting food, reproduction, moving around. What are some of the things plants and animals did differently to accommodate these? Draw and describe a Pennsylvanian cyclothem. Yeah, be able to talk about those. What are they caused by? What are they? What are the units that make them up? What facies do we see? What environments do those facies represent? And ultimately, what causes them? And be able to take it from, how we're moving continents around that upsets Earth's climate. So we have Milankovitch cycles kind of taking over, which cause a 400,000-year ice age to interglacial cycle and on from there. So transgressions and regressions are really important for that. And then describe the climate and sediment changes during the assemblage of Pangea throughout the Paleozoic. So, in other words, the tectonic orogeny, what was the climate like? What kind of changes do we see in the sediments from that? The Acadian orogeny, what was the climate like? So this is early, middle, late Paleozoic, 3 mountain building events. What were the climates like when these were happening, and what was the resulting change in the landscape? So, for example, with tectonic, think about those high sea levels and how this was building up land. With the Acadian, we're building up more land, but we're seeing some red beds in the Catskills. With the Alleghenian, a lot of deserts. So be able to talk about those in a little bit more detail. So I will have some times up soon when we're going to be doing some review sessions. What I'd like to do is have a review session online before we have this exam. But I would recommend getting started studying now. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. And good luck on the exam, and I'll be in communication with you all soon. Take care.